Hey, welcome everybody to our Hearts Connect session for writing as a tool, healing and educating and advocating with author Mary Fairhurst Breen. And I'm going to just switch it right now to the to a different view. Um, so I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement, and then hopefully our elder Susie will be here to open with the an opening and a prayer. So I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, let us take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. We reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to care for the lands and to strengthen relationships between nations, to improve our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples, their unique histories, homelands, languages, cultural practices, and spiritual beliefs, and how we can move forward together in a respectful and meaningful spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. And we invite people to put in the chat if you know which treaty, territory, or where you are joining us from. Tyler, is Susie here yet? No? Okay. All right, so I'm going to introduce Tyler. And Tyler is our Stronger Together program manager and also acting director of Mom Stop the Harm. Tyler.
Hey, well, welcome everyone. It's wonderful to see everyone and, so many familiar faces and names. And, regardless of us being a national organization, it's amazing and quite an wonderful opportunity to be able to come together online and, still be able to like literally see our friends and to be able to recognize one another. And it's just always really heartwarming whenever we do get together. At least for me, it is. So I hope you have a good positive that comes out of it for you too. So with the Stronger Together program, Mom Stop the Harm launched the Stronger Together program. We were able to, I guess, coming up 4 years ago in BC, they were able to receive some provincial funding, which then launched the Stronger Together BC, well, initially what we called it, the Stronger Together BC programming, where they were setting up the peer support groups, the Healing Hearts, and Holding Hope in BC. The following year, then, we got some funding, some SUAP funding, which is Substance Use Addictions Program funding from Health Canada, so on that federal level, and then we were able to launch setting up our peer support groups all across Canada. So I think we have, maybe not currently, but I know we have had, because of course, as we know, life is very real, some days more than others. And but we have had at least one group in each province and each territory, and lots of connections happening and lots of resources being built and really truly coming together as Canadians from all across Canada to be able to support one another in a multitude of fashions, but definitely under the main two titles of Healing Hearts and Holding Hope. I guess I'm sort of preaching to the choir. You guys are very well versed on what the programming is all about, and we thank you for reaching out and joining us as an organization so that we can be supporting one another. And definitely, if there's any kind of questions or anything at any point in time, you know how to get a hold of us, and please do reach out. We appreciate the member engagement on every level. But so I guess I will turn it over back to you, Antoinette.
Thanks, Tyler. So just a quick review for those of you that popped in a little bit after we got started. So today we'll give our presenter about 45 minutes to present, and we'll start taking questions. Please put your questions in the chat window. Tyler's going to help kind of field those and take the questions from there and put them in a private chat to me so that they don't get missed in conversation or things through the chat. And so then we'll bring those up after Mary's completion of her presentation. Is there any questions before I introduce Mary? Any questions in the chat? No? Okay. Okay, so I'm excited to introduce Mary. So welcome as we join Mary Fairhurst Breen, also a Mom Stop the Harm member and Healing Hearts facilitator, to discuss memoir writing as a tool for healing, education, and advocacy. Mary will read from her 2021 book, Any Kind of Luck at All, and discuss how it came to be in the world and how she's used her own story before and since her daughter's Sophie's death. And Open Ed, Mary published in the Globe and Mail based on victim impact statements. Her family prepared for court, captured the attention of the producer of Canadian True Crime, who then hired Mary to write a podcast series about the opioid crisis. You never know who your story will touch. Just recently, she received this DM from someone who picked up her memoir in a used bookstore. Your book is both haunting and healing, and the first time I've actually really been able to see someone's words captivate how I truly feel. Your book has changed my life. Always touches me.
Me too.
Mary has started has shared storytelling methods over many years in workshops for a wide range of audiences. Today, she will give us a few simple ideas to help you take your first steps in putting together your own family story, whether it's just for you or if it's for others to see. Mary will discuss the prickly issue of sharing a story that's not just yours to tell and that others may remember or interpret differently. So join me in welcoming Mary Fairhurst Breen. Welcome, Mary.
Thanks, Antoinette. Thanks, everybody, for coming this afternoon or this evening, depending on where you are, and for inviting me. I really appreciate it. This is my book, Any Kind of Luck at All. It came out in 2021, and the way it came about was, very slow and kind of complicated. It's called Any Kind of Luck at All because my father used to often repeat the joke / cliche, if I didn't have bad luck, I wouldn't have any kind of luck at all. And I had a therapist at one point who said to me, I don't think I've met anyone with worse luck than you. So when it was coming time to publish this book, that was the title I decided I needed. And thanks to this book, my luck has turned around a little bit in some ways. I have a writing career late in life. This book came out when I was 58 in 2021. So it's never too late to do something new. I started writing it in 2014. Just for me, or maybe thinking of an audience of two, my own two daughters. At that time, my daughters, Emma and Sophie, were both alive. Sophie had just been hospitalized for quite a long period and diagnosed with complex PTSD, depression, anxiety, and borderline personality disorder. I had lost a business and lost my shirt. My partner had turfed me out of our home. Basically, everything had turned to rat shit in my life. So I was writing my story going backwards to my mother's story and my grandmother's story, just trying to figure out what the hell went wrong. So it was really just for me. I was in a deep depression myself, and I was just trying to make sense of how did I start out middle class and privileged and end up broke? How did I choose someone to marry and that choice would result in my younger daughter having PTSD? Really, how did I go wrong at every turn? And I wanted to forgive myself as well. I really wanted to figure out if there were some patterns here that made sense, because I knew there were. I didn't just fuck up for no good reason. I swear a lot. If that bothers you, you can bleep it out of the YouTube. I did have a series of like really bad luck, and it was really helpful. I wrote it and wrote it and wrote it. Like it just spewed out of me over Christmas holidays, 2014. Sophie was in Homewood in Guelph, Ontario at the time. And then it just sat on my computer for a really long time. I didn't do anything with it. I only ever meant it to be maybe for my daughters to see. And I also wanted them to see the strength of the women who'd come before them, because neither of them had a chance to know my mother. And I come from a really interesting line of women. So I wanted them to get some strength from that, to know whose shoulders they were standing on. So it sat for a really long time. And then I thought maybe there's something here. And I started to pick it apart into individual stories. And there was one that I thought I would make public. It had nothing to do with my daughter. It was about my own upbringing in a suburb of Toronto. And I read it at a festival. And then there was a bit of serendipity. So in the audience was a woman who recognized our very hippie alternative high school that we both went to. You can't mistake it. It was so ridiculously hippie dippy, this school. And we hadn't known each other. She was a couple of years ahead, but she said to me, when this is a full book, like if you're thinking it'll be a full book, let me know. She was working as an editor at a publishing house, a small publishing house. So about a year later, it was a full book. And I sent it to her. And that publishing house was interested in publishing it. And we were all good to go. And then they went under because I only have bad luck. So it was like, of course you did. Of course you went under because you were just about to publish my book. Sorry about that. So then more time passed, and I worked more on developing the story, and I had a very, very, very long process every step of the way, getting my daughter's approval. So at the time, I thought I was going to write about Sophie's challenges with mental illness and addiction with her participation. And we went through this book line by line. I mean, if she didn't like a colon, I changed it. Like, she had opinions, Sophie, and she was a really good writer. So, and I also had a lot of conversations with my older daughter, Emma, who was very private and had never told people things about her family of origin, like that her father died of alcoholism. He died by suicide, but as we learn things, we learn to name things more accurately. So he died of his alcohol addiction when the kids were young, which is how Sophie came to have PTSD. So they were all in agreement. It was all going to go ahead. My editor had moved over to a publishing house, which was actually a much better choice, called Second Story Press. Here in Toronto, it's a feminist press. And so it was all set to go again in the first part of 2020. And then Sophie died. And I had no idea what I was going to do with this book. I just contacted the publisher and said, I don't know, just let's put it on hold. I don't know what I want to do. But then she died March 4th. The pandemic started March 11th, as you may recall. So I had a lot of time with nothing to do except grieve. It was really not a very good situation. So I took myself to Vancouver, where my older daughter lives, to hang out with her and my granddaughter. And I wrote the rest. Well, I rewrote it, and I wrote the rest about Sophie's struggles and death. And sorry, my dog is trying to get my attention. You can see his tail in the background, and he's making noises. And And I really had to think hard about, I mean, I was writing about her death because I just had to, again, I can only process in written words. I'm very visual. So I didn't know what I was doing this for, but I had to do it. And I had to think really hard about what Sophie would and would not allow me to say. Having been through it word by word, punctuation, like everything with her, I had a very good idea of what she would and would not say. She was already a huge advocate for herself. She was almost finished a social work degree. She was working in the harm reduction movement as a volunteer. She was speaking, to people in recovery all the time. So I thought the right thing to do by her was to put her story out there. And as soon as she died, when I wrote her obituary, I wrote it very, very honestly. And I talked about the cause of death. And I connected it to the opioid crisis. I do it more strongly now. I mean, I will say, as many of you do, that our loved ones died as a result of the opioid health crisis, or worse to that effect. I already was not using the word overdose. It wasn't an overdose. It was a dose. You know what I mean? It was just one dose of fentanyl in a moment of extreme suffering. So it was not an active addiction at the time. She had hardly used for about 6 years, but she relapsed sometimes. And when she relapsed, it was often really scary. But she had never tried fentanyl before. And this time she knowingly bought and took fentanyl. And it was fatal. You all know. So I finished the book and decided it was the right thing to do. I mean, there was 3/4 of the book already there. And then to finish telling Sophie's story as well, I was really hoping for the result that I got when Antoinette read that little snippet of a review, that anybody, even like 5 people, would read this and say, that's what it was like. And yeah, and my loved one was a full person and complex and amazing and like worthy of a chapter in a book. So that's what I did. And it has absolutely met my expectations in that way, which was just to like connect with some people. And so that's how it started. And I'm going to read you a little bit about my daughter, Sophie. I'm going to read to you a little bit about her childhood and about some later struggles and about the community that formed around me to help me through those times. And in between, excuse me, I'm getting over COVID. In between, I'm going to give you some writing prompts because I assume you're here because you're interested in maybe seeing if writing, would be something you'd want to pursue for yourself, for an audience, whatever. I'm sure many of you are already writing in some form or another or expressing yourselves in one way or another. But before I ever wrote this book, I used to teach people to do oral history. I started in the adult literacy movement many, many decades ago now. And I was involved in using oral history as a tool for storytelling for people who had limited literacy. So they could also do research, write their family stories in a bunch of different ways through spoken language. And I'm also just a huge fan of spoken storytelling rather than, I really love doing oral history. So I've been doing that for a really, really long time. And when I start a workshop, Now, normally I would ask you to share. We'd be sitting around a table. I'd invite you to share some of what you write down. We can't do that with such a big group, but I'm going to just tell you how I would start and give you some writing prompts that you can take away and maybe do on your own. So the way I generally start a workshop is to ask everybody to pull out your ID. Just pull out your ID, maybe your driver's license, whatever you have, and look at your name and write a story or tell a story about your name. It's an excellent place to start. Everybody, like, the sentences just keep flowing from your name, whether you're named after somebody or whatever it is. I have a story in my book about my name. I added Fairhurst when I was 11. I was Mary Susan Breen before that because it had come to my attention that there weren't any Fairhursts left, because the Fairhursts had been, on my mom's side, they'd all been girls and they'd married, and nobody was called Fairhurst anymore. And on this side of the Atlantic, like, everybody had a different name. And that seemed wrong to me because I was a budding little feminist or something. I don't know what it was about me. But anyway, I thought I have to add my grandmother's name because nobody has it anymore. So her name was Fairhurst. And I went to court. You couldn't just fill out a thing online, obviously. I went to court. I had to tell the judge why I wanted to add Fairhurst to my name. I thought it was really exciting. And I've been Fairhurst ever since, and I never go by it except for writing, because there's quite a few Mary Breens, and one of them even writes and lives in Ontario, so it's very confusing. And one of them is a nun. I don't want to be confused with her. So I go by Mary Fairhurst Breen, and much, much, much later, like, I don't know, 30 years later, I found out from a cousin who does genealogy, who still lives in England, where my grandmother was from, that the Fairhurst line, as far as she could trace it, goes back to Margaret Fairhurst, who in the 1840s had a boy out of wedlock. Very scandalous. So the boy was called Fairhurst, and on his birth certificate, it says mother, Margaret Fairhurst, father unknown. But everybody knew it was the village cobbler. And my cousin, the genealogist, had figured all of this out. So I just thought, well, there you go. It started with Margaret. Good on her. She had this baby out of wedlock. And then many, many Edwards and Margarets and Marys ensued until you get to me. So there's a story in everybody's name, and I just encourage you to try that. Just sometime when you have a minute, stare at your own name, write yourself a story about it. You never know, like, pretty soon you might have a little school notebook full of stuff. So I'm going to start reading you a few pages about my daughter, Sophie. And if you have thoughts and questions about any of these prompts or anything, just hang on to them, please, and I will happily answer them. So this chapter is called, Do You Believe in God? Which alarmed Antoinette no end, but it's going to be all right. I used to half joke that if Sophie had been born before Emma, she'd have been an only child. Even in utero, she was a handful, calling out the midwives for sustained bouts of contractions on several occasions over a 3-week period before finally bursting onto the scene in a 90-minute whirlwind of agony and ecstasy. She was an utterly charming baby, but tolerated no bullshit from the outset. Her sister had been content with milk from a boob or a bottle, providing it was made available in a timely manner. But this little one screwed up her face in outrage when we proffered a silicone nipple, as if to say, what kind of fool do you take me for? Her whole first year, I had to arrange my work and life to keep the dairy bar open for her 24 hours a day. As soon as she learned to talk, it was like tuning into toddler radio all day long. In the tub, she would make up long, bewitching stories involving a large cast of characters Shampoo bottles, bars of soap, plastic tubs, hairbrushes, and assorted toy ducks and boats. I'd have to keep adding hot water because she wouldn't get out until the plot reached its denouement. By 2, Sophie was an emotional hurricane, nearly tearing the roof off buildings. She would experience fits of frustration, often because she couldn't do all the clever, coordinated things her 8-year-old sister could do. For whatever reason, her tantrums tended to involve stripping off her clothes. Sustained, naked screaming on the floor would ensue. On winter days, I sometimes had to ask a friend with a car to collect us from daycare to get my bare-assed child safely home in the bitter cold. One evening, when Sophie was in kindergarten, I got a call from another mother who'd chaperoned a field trip that day. She wanted to let me know that Sophie had pestered her all the way home on the school bus about matters of a spiritual nature. The woman was more astonished than offended. Sophie had wanted to know, do you believe in God? Why? What do you think God is like? My parents hadn't baptized me, reasoning that they couldn't possibly know what beliefs I'd ascribed to later in life. My kids were raised devoutly atheist, but Sophie wasn't going to take her parents' word for anything without further scrutiny. By the time Sophie was 6 or 7, her tantrums had evolved into junior panic attacks, and my therapist recommended a colleague who specialized in art therapy for children. She met with Sophie a few times, then asked to meet with Dan, that's the pseudonym for my ex-husband, and me individually. In short order, she'd identified Dan's unreliable caregiving as part of the problem and called him in to address his own issues. She told me that since Dan's life was so chaotic, I had to be consistently strong for Sophie, not to show uncertainty or weakness, not to crumble. Sophie would often complain that I was unmovable and unapologetic. I was constantly torn between being a regular, vulnerable person and being her rock, between coming down hard on Dan and giving him room to be a co-parent. I couldn't get it right. Dan was self-medicating heavily, resisting professional treatment for depression and addiction. He saw in Sophie the melancholy he tended to romanticize in himself. She was so bloody smart. She could spot injustice and hypocrisy a mile away. It hurt her when kids were mean and when adults were insincere. Instead of consoling her and reassuring her of the goodness of people, Dan confirmed her suspicion that the world was, in fact, a cold, uncaring place. It was as if he wanted an ally in her misery, someone to support his contention that the universe owed him something. It was impossible for me to know what he was feeding her because we had shared custody and the girls split their time between us. Dan easily convinced Sophie that her therapist was full of shit, so she wouldn't want to go anymore. I did not yet have the confidence to fight back. So there's a first little part, and I want to tell you about another prompt while we're sort of on the theme of small children. When my first granddaughter was born, I wanted to make something for her that told her a bit about our side of the family. She still hasn't heard the story about her aunt and that her aunt died. She's 4. She doesn't remember Sophie. Sophie died when she was 10 months old. My daughter Emma's just waiting for her to ask the questions and then she'll answer them. But she's not introducing, she's done all the reading. She's trying to figure out the right way to do this. It's heartbreaking because quite often Andy, my granddaughter, sees pictures of Sophie at my apartment and thinks it's her. She says, oh, there's Andy when I was a baby, because we just have the one face to go around. We've had it for 5 generations now. All the babies can be mixed up for each other. So I wanted to make something for her, and I was in the middle of digitizing photos. It was another pandemic project. Many of us, I think, engaged in this sort of thing. I had a whole bunch of tubs of physical photos from the days of going to Blacks and getting copies, and 3/4 of them were terrible, but they were all in these bins anyway. So I was digitizing, and I took a series of maybe 25 photos or something like that to tell Andy her story on my side. So and this is something that I really encourage you to do, if only to caption photos before nobody remembers who the people are, which can easily you think you will always know, but you won't. And if somebody inherits all your bins of photos and you haven't done that, it's just a whole bunch of random people. So I started with a photo of when my daughter Emma and her partner Graham first met. So this is where it began. And then I went backwards from me. So a bit about me, a bit about my mother, my grandmother, and one more generation. I went back to the generation that immigrated to Canada. I have more, like the illegitimate son in the 1850s and more on the Irish side. But this was like, I thought that was enough for a kid because she can seek more if she wants to. And all I did was take a photo and just tell like a 1-sentence story about what's there. So my mom was a bacteriologist, which was very unusual for a woman in the 40s. And I had a few marvelous pictures of her in her lab at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto. So I took one of these photos. They're hilarious. My mother is smoking in her lab while diagnosing, while checking bacteria in a microscope. She has a cigarette and her eyes in a microscope, and she's wearing pearls and a lab coat. It's just hilarious. Anyway, so I just wrote, like, your great grandmother was a scientist at a time when not very many women did that, and just a little bit about that. So that's pretty interesting. Your great great grandmother was a mathematician and was admitted to university right after women were admitted in around 1900. So that's kind of interesting. She was a Latin scholar and a mathematician. And then I, came back to the present, and I included pictures of Sophie, and I told a couple of stories about Sophie, what she was like when she was little, sort of comparing her to Andy, some of the things they have in common. And then I just end up with Andy. So I just end up with Andy's birth. It didn't take very long. You can take your captioned photos and send them to any one of a number of companies online, and for a few bucks, you can make a book on quite nice paper with a little cover. So Andy has that. She hasn't seen it yet. It's just there. And I'm glad it's there, like she'll know some things in case there's just nobody around to tell her. I think that's really important. I had to go back. I had to really dig. I mean, I had to go through those bins to write this book and talk to all my cousins because I had such a fucked up family. Like, on my father's side, I wasn't passed any stories at all. He would not say a word about his family of origin, not a word, just silence. So I didn't know anything about what happened there. There were just a lot of really ugly rumors that swirled, and I talked to my cousins about those things and learned that things were even worse than I thought. And it was really helpful to me because I did see patterns, which is what I'd wanted. I wanted to see, well, for example, why all the women cannot pick a partner to save our lives. Oh my God, we're so bad at it. And there were reasons for that. And it really helped me get over, and not guilt exactly, because, I've been in therapy for 40 years. So I addressed the guilt for a long time. But Sophie asked me when she was in hospital in 2014, how I could have had children with that guy. That was a really hard question. Really hard question. Good question. She wanted to know. And I had to figure out an answer. So, I mean, a lot of what the writing was going backwards to figure out, why on earth did I have children with that guy? Why did I do that? I mean, a lot of us ask ourselves that kind of question, right? Usually your kid doesn't ask you why you did that, but Sophie was not one to shy away from demanding to know, like, is there a God? Why did you have children with that guy? When women ejaculate, what hole does it come out of? These were the sorts of things she would discuss, like at breakfast. She was really incredible. So anyway, captioning pictures, it's just a great way to start, you know, and you can just leave them in a box if you want to. You can digitize them if you want to. You can take one sentence and turn it into 10 sentences if you want to. It's just a place to begin, and you don't have to organize the stuff. Like, you could just reach into a bin, take out the first photo in a totally random pile of photos, and caption it. Like, you don't have to undertake the overwhelming task of putting them in chronological order or anything like that. Like, just start anywhere. Because sometimes it's just too daunting, and, you know, that's why the bins just sit in the attic forever. So I'm going to read a little bit more. Okay. This is a chapter called Radical Acceptance. It's a short one. I'm crawling along the 401, too tired to be safely driving. It's the morning rush hour and chucking down with rain. 26-year-old Sophie is in the passenger seat, and I'm trying to keep her alive. It's day 3 of this mission. I had traveled to Guelph, where she lived, on the morning of Mother's Day. I was already burnt out, but she wanted to take me to lunch. First, I had crossed the city to borrow a car, then gotten trapped by street closures for a marathon. It had taken me 2 hours just to break free of downtown Toronto, by which time I was sobbing and had to pee so badly that I went back to my own West End apartment. I don't typically sob on the Gardiner Expressway, but I'd had a week of constant calls and texts from Sophie as she struggled with a steep mood nosedive, and I was scared shitless. She had just spent 9 weeks in hospital in Toronto and was still very vulnerable. She'd checked herself into the psych ward in Guelph for one night, but checked herself out again. It was very uncomfortable for her to go to her local hospital because by this time, she was most of the way through her social work degree and already working and volunteering in the field. In a small community, this guaranteed running into colleagues, professors, and clients at the mental health facility that served the whole region. She'd been doing her best to keep herself safe, but when I finally arrived, it was clear we had to get to a hospital somewhere. Her partner was at work. When he got home, we all agreed we'd hold off until the morning when Sophie had an appointment scheduled with her psychiatrist. We'd ask his advice about where to go. I shared the bed with Sophie. Her boyfriend took the couch. Sleepless night number 1. The doctor didn't really have any good ideas, apart from going back to the Toronto hospital she had entered in winter and not exited until spring. She'd been desperately, diligently researching options and wanted to try another Southern Ontario hospital that offered a mood disorder program. She'd asked to be referred there, but couldn't get in that way. She was told an alternative route might be through its emergency department. Off we went. The triage system was that of a butcher shop. Take a number from a red dispenser on the wall and wait to be served. After 3 hours, a woman who could not touch type spent 15 minutes entering the names of all the medications Sophie was on. After 4 more hours, we were told there were no beds, and in any case, the mood program was only available to outpatients. But Sophie could sleep on the floor if she wanted. On the fucking floor. It was dark by this time. We decided we'd have to try for a bed back in Toronto again, but I couldn't tackle the trip at that hour without risking both our lives, so I drove us all back to Sophie's apartment. Sleepless night number 2. By this time, I was pretty much crying all the time in a most un-rock-like departure from my normally steady calm. Not only was I completely fried, but I'd missed 2 doses of my own antidepressant, which is a time-sensitive one. The next morning marked day 3 in the same clothes. Though I'd showered, I'd pragmatically ditched my undies. Before we hit the highway, I stopped in the downpour for coffee and gas and got soaked to the skin. Of the 2 of us, any observer would have pegged me as the one needing medical assistance. We waited in a room full of people in various states of distress, but this was CAMH, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, at the former Clark Institute, where the staff were highly skilled, consistently respectful, and very kind. I went to the washroom and discovered that I'd managed to rip a huge hole in the crotch of my linen pants, which I was wearing commando. The only saving grace was that I had a short dress over top. My daughter Emma mocks this fashion choice of mine, along with my gold color palette. She says my style combines the aesthetic of Miss Frizzle from the Magic School Bus and the paintings of Piet Mondrian, but it served me well on this occasion. When I got back to the waiting room, a woman who'd been silently detoxing on a gurney suddenly raised her head and declared, "The LED lights are sucking out all my sparkles." I turned to Sophie, explained my wardrobe malfunction, and said, "Mine are falling out directly onto the floor." That made her laugh. In fairly short order, Sophie was back on the ward she vacated the previous month. In fact, she was back in the same room, in the same bed, down but not out, her resilience something to behold. Once she'd been admitted, a friend picked me up. We stopped for malted milkshakes, and I told her the commando/sparkle story. We laughed until I cried a bunch more. Then I got home, downed my medication, ditched some reeking perch that had expired in my fridge, and went to bed. The next night, I was supposed to read at an event. I had won an Emerging Writers Prize for a story about my suburban upbringing. I could not go. I did not have the wherewithal to read about my father's mental illness while my daughter was in hospital. The organizer could not have been more understanding despite my last-minute cancellation. Her own daughter had mental health issues, and she told me she'd spent years never knowing if she could commit to attending anything. That also made me cry a lot, but then I slept for 12 hours. The following day was my 55th birthday, but I resisted the urge to reflect on either the past or coming year. I joked with Sophie that all it signified was eligibility for Shoppers Drug Mart Seniors discount on Tuesdays. I went to work. In the evening, I went to my support group for people with mentally ill loved ones. We discussed the concept of radical acceptance, developed by Marsha Linehan as part of dialectical behavior therapy, which is enjoying a heyday in psych circles. The simple idea reflecting most, if not all religions and philosophies, but seldom practiced successfully, is to acknowledge that while we can change many things, there are some problems we can't solve. Reality is very stubborn. We can't win a fight with the past. We might as well accept the unacceptable, especially if it's already happened, because to do anything else sucks worse. Emma had sent me a Mother's Day card that proclaimed in bold type, "You are a radical woman." I could only hope it was true. Okay, let's see. How are we for time? We want to wrap up by 6:30 at the latest, right? Or whatever time it is there. So another writing prompt that I'll suggest to you to indulge in at your leisure is to write about a piece of advice that a relative or somebody else has given you. When I did that dialectical behavior therapy course, which I think should be just mandatory for humans because it's so useful, I really took a lot from that radical acceptance idea, and it made me think about advice. One, how people we receive, some of it terrible, some of it great. My mother was very lonely and picked her spouse very badly. And when I was thinking about leaving mine before having children, she was worried that I'd be lonely. She was dying of cancer, and she was really worried that I'd be alone to deal with my dad, who was ill, but also just lonely. And that really influenced me. And she was afraid that I'd be poor, like that it takes two incomes. I mean, choosing that guy made me much poorer than I would otherwise have been. But I listened to that, I think to my detriment. But she also gave me the piece of advice, always leave a party while you're still having a good time, which I apply to a lot of things. Like ideally, leave a relationship while you're still having a good time. Leave a job while you're still having a good time, but the writing's on the wall, things like that. Don't wait for it to get like ugly and let that be the last memory you have of the thing. So that piece of, so I just encourage you to think about advice you received and whether you balked at it or accepted it or things like that. Okay, I'm going to do maybe one more quick reading. Then I'm going to tell you about, I think, one of the more important things I did publicly to remember Sophie. And then I think we'll go with questions. So here's where it gets dark. Not that it was light before, but just warning, you get out the Kleenex. March 3rd, 2020, around 8 p.m., Sophie texted me, "Love you lots." I texted back, "That's a nice text to get. I love you lots too." Then she signed off with a blowing kiss emoji. I'd been reading in bed. I briefly thought, is she saying goodbye? But it wasn't at all unusual for Sophie to send me a reminder of her love like that now that our interactions were so positive. I withdrew the question and read a while longer. Sophie was in a rough place, but we, as mother and daughter, were in a smooth place. Our relationship was better than it had been in a very long time. Sophie had gotten angry with me and chosen to cut me off entirely from the previous March through September, and it had been a harrowing 6 months filled with rehashings of all the losses of my life. Sophie could be volatile and hold on tight to a grudge. It was easy to say the wrong thing to her. But then in September, when she suddenly resumed communication, our ability to express our huge love for one another without clashing had been remarkable. I'd finally gotten the hang of pure validation, unadulterated by snippets of advice, and her communication with me had been free of criticism and defensiveness. Perhaps I'd finally absorbed the message my therapist had imparted years before. As impossible as it feels to be Sophie's mother, imagine how impossible it feels to be Sophie. We were finding the possible in our deeply enmeshed, trauma-filled lives. Sophie sent a few other texts that evening, ordinary, chatty messages to her sister and to her fiance. Also to her drug dealer, to thank him for the fentanyl that had taken away her pain. She was, fleetingly, feeling good, maybe even well. I will never fully get this. I once took a single Percocet I'd been prescribed after surgery and hated the high so much I couldn't wait for it to subside. But my daughter had to live in a very different body than I do. She was always at risk for addiction. I couldn't even get addicted to cigarettes as a teen. In this regard, I am simply lucky. Earlier that Tuesday, Sophie and I had communicated by text and online several times, which was normal. She was going to see her doctor that afternoon to review for the umpteenth time whether there was anything different she could try to combat both her mental and physical pain without one remedy creating a whole new set of problems, as so often seemed to happen. We had talked at length on the phone on Sunday when she had confessed to a relapse with heroin a couple of weeks earlier. I reacted calmly, as I always did, and she reacted gratefully to my calm, as she always did. I had sent her a public health warning about a spate of fentanyl overdoses that weekend in the town where she lived. She replied, "Thanks, Mom, I do know about it. I'm not using, but it's still good to share." I don't know if she'd already picked up the fentanyl from her dealer at that point. On March 8th, when the cop phones me, just kind of keep track of where I am. When the cop phones me from outside my apartment door, I was already at work. I've pushed the worry of the previous evening so far down that my first thought is that there's been a break-in. But he tells me Sophie has died during the night. I crumple and wail. I haven't wailed like this for 30 years. I don't know how I'll ever stop or stand up and support my own weight, but eventually I do. My beloved fairy godson comes to collect me and stays with me until Emma and her family arrive from the West Coast the next evening. I have to speak to the coroner, who tells me there was evidence of drugs at the scene. I tell him about the blowing kiss emoji. I say suicide is a strong possibility, but I'm not sure. It doesn't sit right because I know Sophie would never purposely let her fiancé find her body. She had overdosed once before, and he had rushed her to the hospital. I believed, her sister believed, and he believed that she would never want to put him through that again. I have to make a series of excruciating phone calls over the next couple of hours. Whenever I say the words, "My daughter has died," I leave my body and hear myself talking from some distance away. It's disconcerting, but I assume this phenomenon will pass, and after that first day, it does. I fall asleep in the afternoon. I will sleep a lot in the coming days, my body and brain involuntarily but mercifully shutting down at regular intervals. I'm so grateful for this stress response. Okay, I think I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. I'm going to skip ahead to the part where people are helpful. It's called Family Emergency Rate. Just a couple more pages and then I'll open it right up. When I found myself abruptly single, my posse of women friends gathered around me and did a multitude of things to help, both major and minor. I'd never had a large number of friends, going for quality over quantity. I'd been quite timid in my younger days and also too busy to socialize much. But the arts business I ran for 5 years attracted a magnificent collection of creative women. Some came to sell their handmade wares, some to learn a new craft, and some to appreciate the skill and beauty of others' work. They became good friends. I ended up rich in human assets, if not the other kind. After my ejection from Club Crone, so a little aside, I had a woman partner after my husband died, and we moved to a condo, and I called it Club Crone because it was just full of old people and I hated it. After my ejection from Club Crone, they helped me move and gave my bachelorette pad a thorough housewarming that involved the consumption of every ounce of alcohol in the place, right down to the cooking sherry. They were just there, sometimes to fulfill roles a partner would usually play, like picking me up after I had my wisdom teeth out late in life, or taking me to the hospital while I was passing a kidney stone, barely able to speak from the pain, and barfing profusely in the friend's car. I never felt alone in those first months post-breakup, and I still don't. When I took in a foster teen, my friends welcomed her with cards and gifts, hung out with us, taught her cool stuff they knew how to do, and slipped me yoga passes when it became apparent I needed to decompress. They were our village. The first time Sophie was in crisis and in and out of hospital, I was back and forth to Guelph constantly and on a moment's notice. My friends covered for me at my shop, one generously charging me the family emergency rate of $0 per hour. They lent me cars, slipped me bottles of wine, and simply had my back. I was aware, even in the midst of the chaos, what an invaluable gift I had in those friendships. When Sophie first needed a residential treatment program, available only on a fee-for-service basis, the price tag was just shy of $20,000. You know what I'm talking about. In Mama Bear mode, I unabashedly sent pleas for help to anyone of means within my circle of family, friends, and acquaintances. To my utter shock, the affluent spouse of someone I volunteered with wrote me a check for the full amount, just like that. We barely knew each other. We had met at a handful of events. It was a stunningly beautiful gift. Just the fact that a stranger would be so generous lifted Sophie's spirits. Once I showed up on the doorstep of the friend who'd staffed my shop for $0, sobbing because the car rental place around the corner wouldn't let me take a vehicle without a credit card. I was in a period of insolvency, but taking dramatic measures to put my financial house in order. Without batting an eye, she dropped whatever she'd been doing, hopped in her car, and drove me to the hospital where my daughter had been urgently admitted in a whole other town a full hour and a half away. And when Sophie died, the floodgates opened and support gushed in. I'll never be able to properly acknowledge the kindness from small and meaningful to huge and overwhelming. I received air miles points and tiny acorns decorated with Japanese paper, mountains of food, and lines of verse. Although I sometimes feel like the perpetually needy one, I know that I reciprocate the generosity of my friends as best I can with what I have. I use my organizational skills and knack for finding free art events to bring my friends together. I know I throw great potlucks. I offer simple pleasures. And anyway, nobody is keeping score. So I'm going to end the reading there and just tell you about a thing I did on the first anniversary of Sophie's death. No, it was the second anniversary of Sophie's death. The first anniversary of Sophie's death, I just cried copiously for a month. Second anniversary of Sophie's death, I kind of employed the captioning a photo method. And I decided that in the month, there's exactly a month between Sophie's birthday and the anniversary of her death, April 5th to March 4th. So I decided I would post on social media a photo of Sophie with a caption. And I put it on social media partly to be accountable to myself and like have a task. But also I feel really strongly about saying her name, talking about her, keeping her memory alive, not shying away from showing a photo of her. And I didn't know, like, when you put something out on social media, like it just goes into the ether, right? I mean, social media is really horrible in some ways, but I have to use it as a writer. So I did this, and I invited people to send me photos that I might not have seen captioned. And I got so much great stuff. And again, I didn't plan ahead. I didn't lay out 30 photos. I would just pick one at random the day before, write a caption. It might be like a story of 3 or 4 sentences. It might be a couple of words in absolutely no order. And there were things like a particular gift Sophie had given me, a piece of art, and why that. There were pictures of her, of course, and just little memories, all positive, like no illness related stuff. And it really was lovely. You never know who's listening. I mean, people click things, but whatever. But like a year later, I was walking kind of in my neighborhood, and somebody I vaguely know, but we're social media, we follow each other, said, that month when you posted those things, that was so meaningful to me. And I really enjoyed getting to know Sophie. I hardly know this woman. I used to sell her mother's artwork, but like somebody's listening, and you don't know who it is. And it might be somebody going through the same thing. Like you just have no idea. So I really thought it was worth doing. It might be something that you choose to do publicly or for yourself or whatever, just like a memory a day kind of a thing. Maybe many of you do something like that already. And then the final piece I just want to mention, like the big piece of advocacy that I did was something Antoinette mentioned. Emma and I were invited to give our victim impact statements at the sentencing hearing of the dealer who sold Sophie the fentanyl. We were very fortunate. We had a victim services liaison who kept us apprised of everything and coordinated all of this for us and let me talk to the Crown and prosecutor ahead and all kinds of things that most people don't get to do. So we wrote our victim impact statements and we argued that the guy should not go to jail. He had been Sophie's boyfriend 10 years before, and he was in very active addiction. They'd been apart for a long time. And then he ended up in the town next to hers, and he was dealing drugs a little bit, like really just to sustain his own habit, and very badly because he left such a text trail. He was picked up immediately, and he pled guilty because, I mean, he was the world's worst drug dealer. Like, he wrote, "I will bring you the fentanyl at 7 p.m." Like, it was just, he was not a drug dealer. He was just a guy suffering from addiction. And I know Sophie would have convinced him with all her might to bring her the fentanyl. Like, I know she wanted it, and like, Sophie could make things happen. So he made a very bad judgment call, obviously. She made a very bad judgment call, obviously. They were both not thinking clearly. They were both suffering a great deal. And we heard him say that he'd gone straight into rehab when he was arrested. He was out on bail. So, and like quite a few years had passed by after all the delays and everything. He had not used since. The court was packed with people who support him, like his village, his family, and his friends in recovery. And so I honestly feel like Sophie's death saved his life. He grieved when she died. Who knows, right? What was going through his head? He acknowledged that he was having delusions because he was using so heavily. He had no judgment. So he was shocked when she died because he wasn't thinking very clearly, and he was really remorseful. And he had turned his life around. So to send him to jail where his life would be ruined again, and he would probably get addicted again, like, he was 34 years old. It served no purpose. So we wrote our victim impact statements to say that. And we were very, very critical of policies that allow all of this to happen. But we made the point he should not be scapegoated for failures of policy that are so much bigger than one guy. And he was given a conditional sentence. The Crown did not get what she wanted, which was 3 years of jail time. And she said she was going to appeal. And I emailed her and said, don't fucking appeal. Just, like, for who? What? Don't. And she didn't. So we wrote this whole thing for the Globe and for the Globe and Mail. And that's when the producer of Canadian True Crime got in touch with me and said, I'm really interested in that argument of yours. And she hired me to write this 3-part series on the opioid crisis that you can find a link to on my website, which is just myname.ca. And I was really, it was so good for me. It was really hard, but I got to say, it's 3 hours, more than 3 hours of material. I got to say everything I have to say about the opioid crisis in one go. And I might be done now. Like, it's actually all out now. And new developments will make me have new opinions, but like, I got to go deep in the history and deep in the legal stuff and deep in the personal stories. And I collected the stories of 3 other people in Canada who lost loved ones. So my point is, telling your kid's story can have a really big impact. And if you're up for it, I encourage you to do that. And now it is question time. There are some things, like my questions for you that you might think about is why you want to write stuff, who you want the audience to be. And if it's just you, that's great. You can always edit it later if it's for somebody else. If your view is to go public, then is it your story to tell? I would never have written my book and published it without my daughter's permission. And I got permission from everybody in my book to put whatever it was about them. And I cut some stuff if people corrected me because I had the wrong information, which was great. So, yeah, I've talked to lots of memoir writers who just put it out there and like let the cards fall where they may. And I wouldn't do it like that. I mean, people can do whatever they want, but I wouldn't do it like that. So yeah, I've talked for a really long time. Sorry, I will stop now and happily take your
Okay.
questions.
I'm gonna jump in here and I'm just gonna back up and start with the questions that, hang on a sec. Mary, your story is heartbreaking and the word real in big letters. I've read it twice. Thank you for putting your story into the world. And I thank you for this session. My question is about your writing process. Did you write one chapter of your life and then move on to the next, or did you move back and forth in errors over and over? And how did you decide when you were doing the writing and it was when it was ready for publication?
Well, it was 7 years, start to finish. So the first bit was just 5 straight days of just raw, like blah, and just stayed in my pajamas the whole time. It was not like it was stream of consciousness. And then it just sat there. I have this theory that writing gets better if you just leave it alone for a little while, like cheese. So I just left it for a long time. And then I pulled out that one story about my childhood to read at the festival. And then because it went well, I started piecing apart just the raw mess into individual stories, and then won an award. So that, like just a little bit of encouragement along the way. And then I wrote, in no particular order, stories about my parents, my grandparents, my upbringing, Emma, Sophie, my partner. I wrote some funny stuff because I used to be a stand-up comedian, and I didn't want it to be all doom, because why would anybody read that book? Why? I wouldn't. And I've had people come up on a table and read the back and be like, oh no. And no, please feel free. Don't read it. It's not for everybody. So it took forever. And then I had a great editor who, put it suggested a different order, and like an editor is amazing. So yeah, it was a long time getting it into shape.
Okay. Jamie, I see your hand, but hang on, we're going to take the questions that are in the chat first. I'm starting to write a memoir and am first of all trying to decide on what the heart of the book should zero in on. My life is so much like yours, similar experiences and trauma. Do you have any advice on how I can try to pick the main topic or message that I feel only I can write and want to best help people?
I don't think you can know that until you're finished, many drafts. You might think it's going like one way, but then what really comes out is something else. I wrote a chapter about aging without money and like being like precarious employment. And some of my daughter's friends were like, that's really interesting. Like women and aging and what lies ahead and how feminism has and hasn't served us. Like that was really interesting to them. So, and I thought that was sort of filler, to be quite honest. I mean, it's a topic I'm interested in, but it wasn't. I thought Sophie's story was the main story, but in terms of number of pages, it's not. And I think people can get whatever they get out of it. So you might think the main message is one thing, but for somebody else, the main message is something else. And I don't think you'll know until you've finished and you've talked to an editor
Mm,
and they tell you, you know what? Emphasize this. I see this through line in all these experiences. Like, make that connection, you know? You really need more eyes,
nice.
especially if it's memoir.
Nice. I did a similar thing for my son Jeff leading up to the second anniversary of his death. I was pleasantly surprised about all the great comments, and many people didn't know about all the things he was involved in. I was very happy I did. Okay, there was no question there. I'm just kind of scrolling through. How about a compilation book? Oops, sorry, things kind of pop up and move. With 20 short stories about our lost loved ones.
What a segue. 2
Um,
days ago,
okay.
I got word that I got an Ontario Arts Council grant to do exactly that. So I've been trying for a number of years to get funding to do a collection of stories, not biographies, because I mean our kids weren't old enough to have like the CV type biography of all the things they did, and not obituaries that focus on the death. I've been wanting to collect stories about our kids' lives that don't touch on the cause of death, which can so often overshadow the life. And I want to do it in a very creative way. So, still nonfiction, but kind of like paintings. This sounds really like esoteric, but I kind of want to make paintings, but with words. And I've tried this a number of times with Sophie's story, and I have little bits. Like I have a story about her as a theater artist. And that's the whole story. It's about our experience of theater together, her talent as a theater artist. That's all it's about. No context, just that, like a snapshot. And I also, then the bigger project I want to do is also to collect stories of people who died in the AIDS crisis 30 years ago, because that's a lost generation. And now we have a new lost generation. And already the deaths are 4 times higher than they were in the AIDS crisis, believe it or not, in Canada. So anyway, I just got this Ontario Arts Council grant. It's not a ton. It's enough to start. It's enough to collect maybe 10 stories, and I will figure out the parameters around that, because I'll have to narrow like how I choose, but I'll do oral history interviews and I'll create something. The great thing about an arts grant is that you don't really have to commit to the finished product. You'll work on it, and then it might be just a document that's available without copyright. It might be a chapbook. It might be an art exhibit. I don't know what it might be, but I'm going to start on that very thing.
That is awesome. That's
Yeah.
awesome. Like when you said, um, just a great segue. One of the things I loved about what you said is like how you peppered it with humor, and then you, like, I just heard you say, who wants to just read all of the stuff that's so heavy, and it's like how to bring in and remembering the person and all of the sparkles that she had and all of those things. Janie had her hand up, so I wanted to go there. Janie?
Yes, thank you, Antoinette, and good evening, everyone. It's evening here. um, so, Mary, thank you very much for everything, for this story and sharing all your wisdom. Lots of great wisdom there and experience. Um, I wrote letters to my son the first year. That was what was suggested to me from my therapist in order to get through. So I wrote him letters, and I still have those letters. So if I was to create something, I would create something around those letters, and it's a wonderful, wonderful way to share that first year. As many of us can perhaps identify, it was, it's a blur, but yet of numbness and all kinds of stuff, but to be able to write something down, and so if I was to do something, I would just letters to you, something like that, the one that I've lost, in and it really helped me a great deal just to write those letters. Some days I had nothing to say to him, but just hello, I miss you, I love you, and
Mm,
I'm gonna,
that's a
and
great
I
idea,
would
Janie.
and I would
Janie, did
tell
you
him,
have a
I'm gonna
question
do
for
okay.
Mary?
Hey,
Did you have a question for Mary?
and I'm getting to that.
Okay, thank
So, thank you. And so, Mary, would that be something that would, be a great, way to write? I don't know.
It sounds wonderful. I think everybody has a way that works best. I don't think I could write a letter to Sophie. I think I would find that too painful. But
Mhm.
I mean, it's odd, right? Because there's some stuff I can write that's super painful. But we're all different. But to me, like my mind immediately goes to fictionalizing it and having him write back.
Okay.
And then it
I
becomes
like
an
it.
epistolary novel.
That is great. Yes, thank you. Thank you
And
very
maybe
much.
other people, fictional or real, would write letters.
Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks. That's a great suggestion.
Thank you. I'm just looking in the chat because we are trying to just keep the things in the chat. Tyler, did I miss any questions? Sorry, it's when there's a lot of different comments. Just so you know, Mary, just people are thanking you, and then just sharing their personal journeys and stories and things. So Tyler, did I miss any questions right now?
I'm just scanning through as well. I'm just responding to a couple, just showing some support. A lot of thank yous, and I'm not sure, did we, there was a question. My question is in regard to the names of the people written about. Are real names used? How do you decide if used or not? I'm sorry, I don't think that was covered yet.
Yeah, that's the advantage of a real publisher because they know the answer to these questions. So I changed all the names except for Sophie and Emma because I had their express permission. It just seemed like for privacy, it just seemed like a good idea. When not like going backwards, members of my family, but and as I said, my publisher encouraged me to show anybody who was in the book a bit about them. So I mean, I have to say it was kind of fun for me to send my ex the story of our breakup, where I was, quite accurate about her behavior. And I never heard back from her. So I thought, well, fine, she's not going to sue. So whatever. Nobody could. I learned that you can't sue if it's truth. Like you can't sue if you tell the truth. You're free. I was kind of surprised by this. You're free to say anything about anybody, however damaging, if it's true. So you better know it's true and not just your selective memory. But I was careful. I told my ex-husband, members of my ex-husband's family, that I was writing this book, and they weren't in it. I just wanted them to know I was going to be telling their brother's story. And his parents were already dead, but he had two sisters who were not in touch with me or supportive of my children or anything. They were awful. But they immediately came back with, well, show us. I'm like, well, how can I show you that you're not there? Like, I'm just telling you, you're not in it, but your brother's in it. And anyway, there was all kinds of angry back and forth. And then I just finally went, well, fuck it, you're not in it. So just wait for it to come out. You can read it and see that you're not in it if you want to, but I doubt you will. And then they went away. Yeah. But I would suggest changing the names.
There's another question. Was Emma jealous of all the intention that was needed to be there for Sophie? And is Emma currently involved in advocacy, or is she just living her life?
Oh, good question. There were so many things for Emma and I to figure out together because we were very busy supporting Sophie from 2014 onward. And Sophie's health required a lot of our attention. And if you've dealt with someone with, I don't know if borderline personality disorder is even a thing. I don't even know. But if you're dealing with someone with challenging behavior, you have to set boundaries. Emma had to set boundaries. At the same time, Emma flew across the country multiple times to be at her sister's side. She flew from England in the middle of doing research for her PhD to be at her sister's side. Sophie never noticed that Emma took very expensive flights to be at her side all the time. And Emma and I just supported each other through that a lot. And she honored my need to be public and Sophie's need to be public, even though her need was not to be public. But then she has become much more comfortable. So that op-ed we wrote for the Globe we both authored, and her name was on it. And I think she's actually received so much support as a result of my book and all my various op-eds and things that it's turned out to be good. Like so many of her friends read my book and said, I wish we had known what you were going through. Like, I wish you'd asked us for help all those years. You were supporting your sister and we didn't know how bad it was. So yeah, I mean, she's super healthy. She's also been in therapy like all her adult life. And we're really, really close.
Sounds like, you know, that it touched so many people's lives. And I mean, we aren't able to address everything that's in the chat. We're just about out of time. So I just kind of wanted to summarize, like, for those of you that haven't read Mary's book, I think that it kind of prompts a lot of questions to be able to do it. Like, I loved your comment, Mary, about with the editors and how they can give you a different view that maybe you can't, and how do you pull that together, and Janie's question about writing the letters and how could this work, and for some people it might work, and you know, just different ideas. And you know, the prompts, we will be keeping this on our YouTube channel. So I just want to encourage people to go back and kind of go over the prompts. I'm sure if you wanted them, you can email me and Mary can give me a cold notes version and we could share them. Sometimes I know for me, I get into listening and I'm like, oh, what was that? And I was trying to jot down some notes as well. So, you know, just Mary, there's a lot of comments in the chat that we can share with you afterwards. And
I'm having a quick look. Thanks. Yeah.
I think that they're automatically captured. So I just wanted to thank you for being so vulnerable and real with us, and showing up and being you. I know that's one of the things that you do best, right? Is be you. So thank you for the time and for sharing with everybody today. And we thank you to everybody for coming out today and for your questions. And I'm sure it'll be a lot of pondering. One of the questions, and I don't know if you can do this quickly or not, Mary, but when you were talking about your pictures and about posting pictures, do you have a picture that you can show? So, you know.
Oh, I'm so old, Antoinette. It would take me so long to figure out how to screen share. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
You'd all have gone off to have dinner by then. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you. So we'll be adding this. Also just watch our YouTube channel or wherever you saw this information. And I'm just going to say thank you, and I'm going to stop the recording.